One of the, incredible messages that we have to hear loud and clear from this report, it's not too late to avert that level of warming by mid-century. And the trajectories for those most ambitious scenarios would have us reaping tangible benefits in the form of reduced climate impacts by mid-century. Those are the choices we have in front of us, and we have to make those choices about those trajectories this decade.
Aloha and welcome to the flagship event for our talks focused on climate change. The collection is called ʻAuamo, which literally means the breath of the sea, and more poetically, that we are one with the ocean and go where it takes us. In this case, towards an all-in response to climate challenges that lie before us in Hawaii. I am Anu Hittel, and I staff the Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Commission. Maybe because I'm based at the Department of Land and Natural Resources, I compare my work to a water column. The 20-member commission, co-chaired by DLNR and Office of Planning, is made up of legislators and department heads and works at the pelagic level. It sees the sunshine, but also weathers the storms. I work at the benthic level and with the state's many partners, departments, and supporters. The commission was established in 2017 as Hawaii looked to do its share towards the Paris Agreement. As nations come together at COP26 in Scotland to take more ambitious climate action, we bring to you keynote Dr. Kim Cobb, lead author of the climate report of the Ipcc, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We'll tie that into on-the-ground efforts in Hawaii. You will hear a conversation with KUA Executive Director Kevin Chang. This collection of talks is a partnership between the University of Hawaii's Better Tomorrow Speaker Series and the Climate Commission. This is a surprisingly interactive format, so our AmeriCorps Vista, Diana Lopera, and I will be around in the Zoom room to engage in discussion, field your questions, and send them on to my colleague and today's moderator, Dr. Victoria Keener. Before we get to that part of the program, as with our statewide conferences on climate change, we are honored again to have with us today Governor Ige to address us and start this series. Thank you for being here, Governor, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Anu. I appreciate, and thank you so much for organizing this conference and giving me the opportunity. Aloha to all. I'm glad to be here to open the ʻAuamo collection of talks on the climate crisis. And I want to thank Dr. Kim Cobb for spending time with us and sharing her perspective. I don't need to spend time restating the obvious challenges of a dangerously warming world, but I do want to talk about why this issue is so important to Hawaii and our Pacific Island neighbors. And I want to make clear that government action at the subnational level, or as my colleague, Governor Inslee likes to say, supranational level, is needed, doable, and in line with how society can and should function. First, just as with the human body, elevated temperatures are dangerous for the health of our planet. Climate change is an existential threat to Hawaii and our Pacific Island neighbors. Like traditional navigators in Hawaiian voyaging canoes, we can see the storm clouds ahead. The storm is real and the situation is severe. But I do also know this. Like the crews of a voyaging canoe, we can and we must paddle together, guided by keen navigators to achieve our goals to reverse climate change and heal our planet. Together, we will help each other arrive at a more sustainable and equitable world for all of us. And this brings me to my second point. Real and lasting change at the subnational or supranational level, depending on your perspective, can be made to work and we will all share the benefits. Furthermore, Hawaii is playing an important role in this effort. We led the world in being the first to commit to 100% clean renewable energy for electricity. We were the first state to show our commitment to climate action by embracing the Paris Agreement in law. And we were grateful that this year, the US rejoined the Paris Agreement and renewed its pledge to keep global warming under 2 degrees. And this year, the Hawaii legislature declared a climate emergency by resolution. In addition, I joined with 25 other governors in the US Climate Alliance to move the country forward in a more responsible way. The Alliance is a formidable organization representing 55% of the US population and an $11.7 trillion economy, an economy that is larger than all countries but the United States and China. Hawaii is also part of the Under 2 Coalition, a coalition of 260 local governments around the world committed to keeping global temperature rises to well below 2.0 degrees in efforts to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. Together, subnational or supranational leaders are building the structures for a healthy, vibrant, and balanced world. The pandemic highlighted the importance of our connections to each other and with each other and the natural world. It also highlighted how interconnected societies and communities can work together to manage huge global threats. This lesson applies to meeting the climate crisis. Building Back Better means broad-based, inclusive approach to pandemic recovery. It means ensuring that stimulus packages boost sustainable businesses, increases investment in climate-smart practices that create jobs to address equity, resilience, and clean energy. Means increasing investment in nature-based solutions to protect our beaches and natural lands and becoming more resilient. In Hawaii, nature-based solutions will help us go beyond zero emissions to a sub-zero future. We have a target to sequester more than we emit as quickly as practical, but no later than 2045. To do this, we need to capture emissions through natural and working lands and directly from the air. The State Climate Commission emphasizes that nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, and carbon-smart practices must be prioritized for a climate-ready Hawaii. We have embraced these big ambitions because we know that big ambition leads to big action. Hawaii is all in to address the climate crisis. This is the message that we will be taking to COP26. In Hawaii, reversing the climate crisis is critical to preserving our unique biodiversity, our unique culture, and our economy. That's why Hawaii is leading once again and showing how small islands can move the world with aloha and innovation. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this. Aloha.
Aloha, Governor Ige, and thank you so much for those remarks to start this talk. And now how appropriate that we're moving on, talking about big ambition, going into COP26, talking to a climate scientist today who helped lead the Ipcc reports. I would now like to welcome our next guest, Dr. Kim Cobb. She's an oceanographer, a paleoclimatologist, and a geochemist who specializes in analyzing changes in coral and climate in the Pacific and Indian Oceans over very long time periods. She's the director of the Global Change Program at Georgia Tech, the winner of the Hans Osger Medal, and she's one of the lead authors of the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, one of the most important responsibilities, volunteer responsibilities, I might add, among climate scientists worldwide. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kim.
Oh, it's fabulous to be here. Thanks so much.
So can we start out, we've been talking about these global ambitions and the IPCC report. So it's an amazing achievement to be selected as a lead author for the IPCC. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about?
I have no idea. I mean, I'm still recovering from that process. It's hard to think about it as an achievement when really, it's 150 some authors from around the world working over 3 years. Half of that time was before the pandemic and in-person meetings, and half of it was fully virtual at all hours of the day and night as we coordinated across these international leads. So it was an experience I'll never forget, and just a toil of purpose and love and passion that has really stuck with me to this day. But I'm still trying to reorganize my life around the disruptions that it caused. But it's worth it, obviously.
Yeah, I think it is important to point out again that all of the scientists from across the globe that work on these assessment reports, they're doing it in their spare time, basically, as a volunteer job. But can you tell us about some of the conclusions that are relevant to especially this region and the 6th IPCC report, which for everyone watching was published very recently in August? What are the latest consensus findings and what might be at stake here?
Well, the report is quite clear about the role for human-caused fossil fuel emissions in driving the warming, calling that link unequivocal for the first time. I think that's important. Now, for most people who've been tracking this, that's not news, but there are some really important new aspects to the report that link, for example, those rising greenhouse gas emissions to any number of weather and climate extremes at this point, which we can really, tie to sound physics. And those would include drought, wildfires, extreme rainfall, tropical cyclones, urban land heat waves, as well as marine heat waves. So, all of those things are really relevant to that region of the world, and of course, many others as well.
Yeah, some of the biggest findings seem to be around that new attribution science. They're really looking at these events, the extreme events that are coming out. But most of that information and a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is unfortunately pretty dire. But this report does stress the point that it's not too late to act, and that we still do have a small window of opportunity to stave off the most catastrophic effects, and that everything we do is really, we're creating an incrementally better future. Why do you think it was important to frame the report in that way, that there's that we still can act? And how does the science support that?
Well, I hope we can get into this over the course of our discussion tonight. But, the IPCC report has historically really amassed information about our potential emissions trajectories over the next 100 years and how they translate into warming levels, and how those warming levels, of course, come with a known set of impacts that we can, of course, increasingly tie to warming levels and, of course, greenhouse gas emissions. And so the most ambitious trajectories that were considered during this particular assessment report were some of the most ambitious trajectories that were outlined during the Paris Agreement, in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And so what we saw coming out of the report was a whole range of potential emissions futures, but it was those ones that were the most ambitious, the really low emissions trajectories that we were looking at very closely to see if we could answer the question, is it too late to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? And it just so happened, I think we can say that it's not too late. And that is, again, a very important finding that you're highlighting here. And amidst all the doom and gloom, one of the incredible messages that we have to hear loud and clear from this report, it's not too late to avert that level of warming by mid-century. And the trajectories for those most ambitious scenarios would have us reaping tangible benefits in the form of reduced climate impacts by mid-century. those are the choices we have in front of us, and we have to make those choices about those trajectories this decade.
Yeah, and there are a lot of, I know we'll get into this when we talk more about your personal research, but a lot of the mid-decade or mid-2050s or so outlooks for coral reefs across the region and across the world, those are when we're going to be starting to see a lot of, projected annual bleaching. And so knowing that there is still time is very important for this region and ecosystems across the world. I wanted to very briefly touch on, you're talking about scenarios that are used a lot in the Ipcc. And for people who don't keep up with, there's just a library of scenarios that come out looking at all of the different possible futures. But something that that may not be as clear to people who aren't climate scientists is how the different uncertainty in those climate futures is not always dependent on the science, but it's on what people do
Yes.
too. Can you talk about how kind of the socioeconomics play into the creation of how we envision those different futures? And then the IPCC.
Yes. So there's a whole science just in terms of outlining what are these possible emissions futures for our planet over the next 100 years. As you can imagine, you have to take into account population growth. You have to take into account the economic development of different nation states over time. And it's really again, it's its own science. And so what those folks do is hand over these potential futures that track the emissions that may be made each year between now and 2100. And they have to span such a dizzying range. And you look at them and, they're delivering us either a world that's cooling by 2060 or a world that's, on an accelerated warming trend in the latter part of this century. And so I'm quite fond of making that point that you just made, that most of the uncertainty about where we're going with climate change is about the emissions choices that we're making this decade and next decade, and increasingly less and less to do with our ability to translate a given atmospheric CO2 concentration into warming or, of course, related impacts. And that's something that this report also made very clear.
I think that is such an important point that I hope all of our viewers are taking home, that really it's people and we have these choices and we can make it through policy.
Right.
And so going on to talk about your work in policy a little bit more, you are a physical scientist,
Right.
But how did you come to work more and inform to advance climate policy as well as engage in some advocacy as a scientist?
Yeah, so it really was pretty recently. I think that up until 2016, I really felt like if we just handed over the best available information, that somebody would steward that like a precious gift into the kinds of policies that it was really clearly calling for. And I think it was really a very harsh wake-up call for so many of us who've been working as climate scientists for decades, that the data was not enough by itself, that we needed to speak to the data quite clearly as often as we could, and that, of course, we were also going to, at the same time, have to defend the entire field of climate scientists and, in ourselves, sometimes individually as well, from a spate of politically inspired attacks on our field and on our data in our decades of accomplishments as a field. And so, how you position yourself in this is, a very fraught decision. But for me, it really meant that I was going to use my voice and whatever privilege I have in the field as a senior scientist to try to give voice to the data and defend the data from any politically inspired attacks, because the data are not our enemies. The data are our friend, and really try to make sure that I engage wherever possible with policymakers, because that's the other key, right? Even people who absolutely care about this issue and understand the data and where we are positioned right now, are facing a lot of different competing demands in their day jobs. And so helping them see how policies that are data-driven and science-based in climate can also deliver tangible benefits at the city level, state level, and national level is really where we've evolved right now. And I'm happy to be having those conversations with policymakers more and more.
Thank you so much for that. It is quite a difficult job, as I have experienced as well. So getting back to the data a little bit, not to get too wonky about it, but your work.
We please?
It's a problem with having two scientists talk to each other. Your work is on coral reefs in large part, and in coral reefs in the Pacific, which are very dear to people in Hawaii and throughout the Pacific Island region. And so I think a lot of our viewers understand how things like tree rings and ice cores can be used to reconstruct climate data in the past, but how do corals do so? And can you talk a little about your research on coral histories and paleoclimate in the Pacific region?
Yes, absolutely. So I've been working in coral reefs in the equatorial Pacific region in the Republic of Kiribati, a place called Christmas Island, if you know it, folks. And I've been working on those island chain, the Northern Line Islands, for over 20 years now. So that's a long time. And what we've been doing is we've been collecting corals that have been growing on the reef there, collecting them on beaches. Those are much older corals. And what we do is we cut them open and we look at the chemistry of the skeleton that grows through time. So they grow about, 1 centimeter or about a finger width every year. And by drilling it very fine detail and analyzing the chemistry of the powders in the coral skeleton, we're actually able to reconstruct ocean temperatures for that time period. It's like a time capsule of ocean temperatures. And so we've been able to track back over the last 100 years, last millennium and more, the coming and going of ocean temperature extremes. In our case, the biggest, hit that those regions take is with El Nino events, nothing that Hawaii doesn't know a lot about.
Thanks. And so I wanted to ask you next about some of the field work and analysis you did in the Pacific Islands region, and about if you could talk about how some of the reefs you've been studying throughout your career have changed recently, and how you've observed it, and maybe connect that to what propelled you to get out of the ocean and the lab and start working more in advocacy. What was that event like for you?
I mean, it definitely played a very critical role. So, I've been diving on these reefs all over the Pacific since I was a baby graduate student in 1997, and working, continually at the same site. So much so that when I scuba dive at those sites, I see the same corals growing up over decades, and I know the reef like I know my house. Basically, every nook and cranny of that reef, I know I call my home away from home. And so when I dive on those reefs and we're looking at an increasing pattern of ocean heat waves and marine heat waves at these sites, it really took the 2016 El Nino event, which was one of the largest on records. We saw it coming for many, many months. And so we planned many expeditions about every 3 or 4 months down to the equator to try to document this event from a scientific perspective, its impact on the reef biodiversity, on coral health, on chemistry, on oceanography, on the atmosphere, on water levels. And so on one of these expeditions, we started to see some massive scale bleaching in 2015 at the research site on Christmas Island. And then another return visit in November, we saw much more, about 70% of the reef was undergoing some stage of bleaching. And then I came back to Georgia Tech and I watched on the satellite temperature feed that, the temperatures were reaching much, much higher levels, 31 degrees Celsius, which was unprecedented at the site. It had never been measured there. And then, I had to think what was happening to the coral reefs there. And indeed, when we went back in April, we saw that the worst had come to be. And of course, it had to be physically and biologically the case that those corals were unable to withstand the extreme duration and intensity of ocean temperatures that occurred during that event. And you have to remember, this is a El Nino event on top of a steady tropical warming trend that is very well documented over the last 50 plus years. And so it's that kind of pile-on that tipped this reef over the edge. When I first got in the water that morning, the reef was unrecognizable in our April expedition. It was just blanketed by red-brown algae kind of wafting in the currents, and there was no color and no structure. And I know I'm speaking to people who love reefs, who know reefs, what that must have felt like to see that. And indeed, I think even though intellectually, in my mind, I knew that I would be looking at something like that, I actually haven't ever recovered from that. Because I think in my back of my mind, I thought somehow the reefs would be resilient. It would be less damaged than we thought. Somehow there's a key to Mother Nature we don't understand. Nope. Actually, 85% of the reef was killed during that ocean temperature extreme. And so just thinking about, as a scientist, what does it mean when something that you love is perhaps gone forever? What does it mean that something very special about its history, something special about what it's going through today? And, it's happening much sooner than we thought, much sooner than I thought as a climate scientist who knows the data. It happened much sooner than I thought, that loss. And so, when you come back from that kind of experience, first you want to share that. You really want to help people understand what you saw. You want to help people understand what it means for our choices, for what's at stake, for the losses that, we know are coming in the future, how it feels. But you also want to make sure that you are turning all of your attention to try to help people understand, what has to happen now to avert future losses, that we still have time to avoid those losses. And so that's really when I, got extremely engaged in this kind of advocacy and communication and engagement work, and have been really ramping up ever since, to the point that I do, dozens of events every month, trying to really help people understand where we're at and what this new report means and what our choices are, what the stakes are this decade.
Yeah, thank you. And I know that's a very difficult, experience that you had. And I'm so glad that you are out here talking about it, as painful as I know it is. Some of the work that I know you're doing with Georgia Tech now is with your students. You work to identify carbon sources that are comparatively easy to reduce. And as you get into more climate mitigation and solutions, kind of looking at those low-hanging fruit of climate mitigation. Can you talk more about your program? I know we have questions that are coming in from the audience of, there's a lot about what can we do, personal as well as collective action. Kind of what does your program do? What are some of its successes?
Yeah. So this is a program I've been running for 10 years. So if you do the math, I was already understanding as a baby professor that I really wanted to find a way to engage students in the climate solution. And I wanted to really, tap their passion for being engaged in solving climate, right? And I also wanted to make sure that I was expanding carbon literacy. So that's the nerdy professor part of me speaking, right? Because everybody knows what, $40,000 is, but nobody knows what 40,000 pounds of carbon is in terms of carbon currency. And so I started a program called the Carbon Reduction Challenge in 2007. So I guess it's almost 15 years now. And what it does is it takes teams of undergraduate students and partners them with external organizations, and sometimes Georgia Tech as our own playground of campus opportunities, and tries to think about the development and implementation of a large-scale, frankly, energy efficiency project that reduces greenhouse gas emissions at a very large scale while typically delivering cost savings to the organization. And so this has been wildly successful. Our first couple of years, we were talking about 10,000 pounds of CO2 here and 10,000 pounds of CO2 there. just a note of carbon literacy for the audience. The average American is responsible for about 40,000 pounds of CO2 per year. So that's a unit, and the number you might want to keep in mind as we rattle through some of these massive scale changes in carbon budgets that we're up against. But the latest cohorts of students that have been working in the Carbon Reduction Challenge are talking about, averting 20 million pounds of carbon dioxide from ever being emitted because of the projects that they have been uniquely responsible for developing and then working towards implementation with their organizational partners. So I'm incredibly proud of the students. And I'm also recognizing that most organizations are happy to work with students to save money and save emissions. So there's a sweet spot there of students and emissions and revenue that I think can provide a lesson for all of us in thinking about how can we engage not just at our individual or family level, which also can feel sometimes hopeless or, not at scale. But also, sometimes we're looking at the state and federal landscape and going, maybe it's not fast enough, we need more. We forget that there's this mid-level of organizations that are comprised of hundreds and thousands of people and really large carbon footprints. And many times when you ask a large organization why they do it that way and not this way, they say, because we've always done it that way. Well, what if you could save some money and save some greenhouse gases from some of these changes? And so one of the projects I love to point to is a project with SunTrust Bank, now known as Truist, where a team of students work to change the default car rental from intermediate size to economy size. They were fortunate enough to pitch their idea to the CEO one afternoon at the end of their 10-week program. It's just a 10-week program at Georgia Tech. And the CEO turned to his CIO, Chief Information Officer, and said, how long would it take to implement this change? And the gentleman said it would take less than 5 minutes. And he said, it shall be done. And so by changing that default, they've been able to measure the impact on carbon emissions and revenue savings for the company. And it's exactly how they predicted. It's a massive change. So some of them are no cost like that. Some of them require upfront costs, kinds of LED retrofits and things that you may be familiar with. But it's a great lesson for the students. And it's a wonderful reminder about the scales that we often overlook.
Yeah, that is great. And it's a great example of kind of that mid-level opportunity that is less politically polarizing as well, especially since we're in such a contentious time on a lot of these different issues. So with that, maybe we can transition into talking a little bit more about politics and policy. And I hope that there were Hawaii businesses out there listening to Dr. Cobb talk about that project and about how easy it can be to make some of these changes and really make a big difference. So you are working in now what I guess is a purple state of Georgia, and you have to focus on the low-hanging fruit sometimes because a lot of the big changes are out of reach. What have you learned about effective science communication in a political environment that is infected with a lot of climate denial? And you talked about some of that with the projects, but I have to assume that you work across all sorts of different scales, both state, locally, nationally.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I've been working on since 2016 is trying to get more and more involved in research on climate solutions. And so I think it's fair to say that most people, well, it's not fair to say, actually, polls show that the majority of Americans are concerned about climate change. They understand the links between greenhouse gas emissions and warming and the kind of climate impacts that we would like to avoid. And so when we think about talking about climate change in a state like Georgia, we're really, eager to connect the dots between the kinds of impacts that people are seeing on the ground. Hurricane Michael was devastating to farmers in South Georgia, for example. They lost pecan crops, blueberry crops that are generations old farms, et cetera. And so many people are still reeling from that kind of change. On the coastline, we have words that can hardly be spoken: Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Matthew, from the levels of devastation that they raised on our coast. So helping people connect the dots between climate change and these kinds of local risks is really important. So underscoring the tangible risks, but also increasingly helping people understand what we have to benefit from the full-throated embrace of the science. So what do I mean by that? I mean, how can we leverage this incredible information we have from climate science to keep communities safe, to keep them prosperous, to help them be resilient to the coming impacts that we already can see on the horizon? And moreover, how can we make sure that Georgia is well positioned to benefit as the whole global economy transitions to a low carbon economy? So we don't want to be left out of that game. And so again, talking about minimizing risks and maximizing opportunities, that's really what is bringing our conversation together. I'd love to point people, that's the tagline for a statewide program called the Georgia Climate Project, which is exactly having those kinds of conversations focused on lifting up the science, having conversations, and thinking about what we can do to bring more people into the conversation. So I encourage people to check out that website.
Great, that's a great example, and maybe we can have it in the chat later on as well, so people can find it. So talking about framing risks and communicating risks about climate in ways that people really relate to and that they value in their daily life, we have some questions coming in about how climate can relate to deadly health emergencies. So, I assume that maybe they're talking about COVID and to some extent, but also other types of layering, health emergencies, risks to community health, personal health. Yeah. What kinds, in talking about framing risks and communicating, what kind of frame do you think we could take in terms of communicating if climate change will have an impact on individual or community health?
Well, we just wrapped a big symposium at Georgia Tech where we had a whole day devoted to climate and health, and we had some amazing experts come in and school us up. So with the caveat that this is not my area of expertise, I simply love this quote from The Lancet, one of the leading medical journals in the world, from 2018, and I'm going to read it. "Climate change is the greatest global health threat facing the world in the 21st century, but it is also the greatest opportunity to redefine the social and environmental determinants of health." And I was joking on Twitter, I want to get that tattooed on my arm. But really, what do they mean by that? They mean that climate change, we already know, will hit the low income, largely communities of color first and worst. That's true globally, that's true nationally, and it's true in a city here like Atlanta. And so those are the communities that are already bearing the brunt of COVID-19, for example. Those are the communities that have historically borne the brunt of the contamination and environmental degradation from our fossil fuel infrastructure. Those are also the communities that have historically suffered from the worst air pollution that we have in this country and around the world, caused by our burning of fossil fuels. And so it's true both from a climate change vulnerability perspective and impacts lens that this is a health emergency that we need to get in front of from a climate justice perspective. But it's also equally true that the solutions that we are reaching for are going to deliver a healthier world to those people who have historically suffered at the hands of fossil fuel economy and other socioeconomic injustices in historically marginalized communities. So that's really what we're talking on. We talk about climate change as a health threat. We really have to keep in mind those communities who have suffered historically and have the most to gain from our transition to a low carbon economy.
Mm-hmm. Very well said, Dr. Cobb. Thank you. And I will point out that those remarks are true in Hawaii and the Pacific Islands as well, where we also have the added legacy of colonialism across the region and in the state to deal with. So these are all factors that have contributed to making some populations more heavily vulnerable than others. So back to looking at political levers for action. What political levers do you think there are at the state and local scale to start some of these conversations and really move us where we need to be going in terms of climate action? What levers are there that we might not be using yet?
Well, I can tell you from the front lines here in Georgia and what some of the things that are really seem to be taking off here at a scale that, rests above the individual and not at the state level. And that is the idea of bringing together collectives. And, Governor Ige was talking about this so eloquently when he spoke of his colleagues across the nation who are coming together as governors and thinking about how they can band together for collective action. And that's exactly right. He's absolutely right. But we can also think about that at other scales. So here in Georgia, there's something that's coming together called the Drawdown Georgia Business Compact, which brings together business leaders and challenges them to come up with a framework for their own ambitions and walking their own path towards collectively agreed upon goals. And this is what we need to create the kind of momentum and the peer group and the sense of joint action and energy to move forward. And also in Georgia, we're thinking about bringing together institutions of higher education. Many institutions of higher education do have climate pledges. I'm not sure about UH Manoa. I see a climate committee at UH Manoa. Maybe there is a climate pledge, but how can we come together across institutions? Because these institutions are cities within cities, right? Mm-hmm. And they're the nexus for not just so much economic opportunity and growth and vibrancy and innovation, a term that Governor Ige also used, but they're also where we are training the next generation. And this is where it's critically important that we not leave them out of our climate action plan, that we think about how we're using our universities and our public school systems, which are also vast networks touching hundreds of thousands of people, not just the students, but their families, how we can band schools together for collective climate action. So I challenge you as audience members to think about what are the organizations that you are tied to, whether it's your workplace, whether it's your university, whether it's your children's school or your church, and try to think about how you can band together other organizations within that type of organization and think about what that collective might mean for you. So I'm very excited about that work that we're doing here in Georgia, and I hope to see it, spread like wildfire and really gain traction.
And there are more and more universities that are divesting from fossil fuels as well. Some big names in the news recently.
Yes, Harvard, I think, was the latest.
Yep. But I want to continue on your challenge towards the audience. So we sometimes or often frame climate adaptation and mitigation in terms of what we need to sacrifice and to make a better world for people in the future and for us now, consuming less, eating less meat, driving less, which is all true to an extent, but you also argue that we need to hold out the promise of a more joyful, richer future on the other side of this action. What do you mean by that?
Yes, I think that I have to admit that for 14 years as an Atlanta resident, I just drove my car around, which is what everybody does here in Atlanta. And I parked my car in the lineup, waiting for dropping my kids off at school, idling for way too long, as I'm sure any parent in the audience can attest to with the carpool lane. And so I really want to own that and note that this kind of, thought experiment and real world experiment has been relatively recent. But I am here to tell you that it has been much more rewarding than I ever thought possible. And so my first step on this low carbon journey of mine and my family's was in 2017. So again, very recently. And I just started thinking, well, what am I going to do? It's well and good to call for climate action on all these different scales and to call for evidence-based decision making and follow the science. What is my role? And I was starting to feel this kind of misalignment between what I knew was probably required of every individual on the planet and how I was living. And yes, there are many excuses I could give about I'm a busy mom of four, which is true. My husband and I both have full-time jobs, which is true. I live in Atlanta, which is pretty terrible for a lot of bike pedestrian infrastructure. If you've ever been, it's hot and cold. Oh my goodness. So, I was able to kind of talk myself out of it, but I could no longer do that. So I took 2017, the leap And I said, well, let's bike to work once a day in 2017. That was my climate resolution for January on New Year's Day. And so I got on my bike. It was all this hoopla. I wasn't really sure how it was going to work. And within a month, I was biking to work every day. And within 3 months, my husband was biking to work every day. And I started to think, this is now an inseparable part of my life and will be with me till I die. And I absolutely love it. And I would make many life decisions to preserve this beautiful thing in my life. And I never, ever thought of it that way. And so I started asking myself, well, what is next then? What other kind of thing could I take on my own personal path towards a low carbon future that looks like sacrifice from the outside, but that might not be? So I started adding on all these other things. And I just keep asking myself, what's next? And every step that I take, I find myself getting closer and closer to what I know will be our world in 2050. It will be a low carbon world and it will be very beautiful. And so I just keep asking myself and everybody who wants to listen to me, what does your 2050 world look like, right? What are the joys that you will be reaping in that world? And what would it take to get you to try some of those out right now? Because it's not all sacrifice. It actually is a beautiful way to live, slow, on the ground, dealing with vegan recipe books. It's a curiosity driven path. It's just very rewarding. And I frankly highly recommend it.
Thank you. That I did need a little bit of positivity right now. So it's really good to hear that. I'm so sorry to all of our questions coming into the audience from the audience. There are a lot of great questions, but we are running out of time. I hope we got to a lot of them. And Kim, maybe during our next segment, you can open in the Q&A box and answer some of the more specific, some technical questions that are coming in. I just wanted to end with this. So in the lead up to COP26, we've got a big moment. We've got a big opportunity coming up. What is different this time? What do we need to do? And what does it really mean to go all in on climate action for this COP?
Yes, I mean, the stakes could not be higher going into COP26. And I think that that's immediately apparent to everybody. We now have this huge pile of robust science to guide those policy decisions and understand just what's at stake in our future and how much we're going to need to work this decade. We can't wait for another conference of the parties to roll around for us to get to work. Many of the stars are aligned globally. This is the moment to try to think about bold, sweeping change. Leaders have been talking about this. They've been trying to work forward laws and frameworks and policies in their own nations and at the state level as well. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of ambition and a lot of hope. And now it's time to capitalize on that. I think with respect to Hawaii in particular, I'm really excited to remind folks about the outsized power that the small island nation group had in Paris in 2015 in not taking as the most ambitious target, a target of 2 degrees Celsius. If claiming that is just too high and demanding 1.5. And look where we are today. Coming around to the realization that 1.5 degrees Celsius is ostensibly our new target as a globe, that beyond that is levels of danger and risk that we are unwilling at this point to embrace. So I want to call that into the room tonight and to think about the power, both the moral power, but also the cultural heritage and just the immense, weight, the gift that are these nations and these islands to our planet as an ocean world, that your voices have outsized impacts and that you can use them to great purpose. So that's what I wanted to leave you with tonight. And for all the participants who won't be at COP26, please engage with your communities, engage with the organizations that we talked about before, and don't leave anybody behind. Catherine Hayhoe talks about the importance of talking about climate change at every turn and really bring people along with you. That's equally important. That's part of what it means to go all in on climate action.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cobb, for your work and your vision, and good luck with everything going forward. And I really do hope I get to meet you in person in Hawaii or somewhere else at some point. Thank you so much. For the next part of the program today, we wanted to bring in a local voice to really bring it down from that global to local scale to really talk about levers for climate action and community involvement here. And so now I'd like to introduce Kevin Chang. Kevin is the Executive Director of KUA, an innovative community-driven organization that advances community-based natural resources management in Hawaii, working together with community and government agencies towards restoring Hawaii communities' traditional role as caretakers of their lands and waters. Welcome, Kevin.
Aloha, Victoria, and everyone. Nice to be here.
So, Kevin, you are here and you just returned from the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Marseille, France, where you were part of the Hawaii delegation, an instrumental part, from what I hear, in passing Motion 3 and hosting the Indigenous Peoples Organization event. And can you tell us more about that experience, especially as it relates to climate action at that local scale?
The World Conservation Congress probably is the only largest global conservation event that now allows Indigenous people a seat at the table to vote on motions and regarding how we take care of our world. And when we were there, we did support, co-sponsor, and help pass Motion 3 to create a climate change commission within the IUCN, which is a big deal within the IUCN. But for me, the biggest accomplishment we contributed to was a global Indigenous agenda for conservation, as well as the passage of Motion 48, the renunciation of the doctrine of discovery, which is a doctrine that underlies the past 500 years of colonialism and dispossession and severed relationships from communities and their places. And it's the first time in 500 years nations have ever voted on the concept.
So a lot of those issues that were talked about at IUCN were by nature global, and you've talked about some of the key outcomes. How can we implement those recommendations at the local scale in Hawaii and help ensure that local communities are having their voices heard?
Well, to start with, the renunciation basically is saying that we have, for whatever reasons, severed ourselves from the way we once related to the earth, and that acknowledging that we can rebuild a culture that's more regenerative. And that's communities in Hawaii have been asking and pushing for that for the last 100 years. Our work basically is about supporting community governance, community environmental governance. And environmental governance is a traditional cultural practice embodied in the state constitution, embodied in the laws of our state. But now we have laws that are beginning to actually engage that relationship with people, especially Native Hawaiian communities, through the management or co-management of the environment with communities. So we have a law called the Community-Based Subsistence Fishing Area Law. This allows communities to begin to engage our government in the governance of their natural resources, especially when their communities often laying on the periphery, where government actually is pretty absent, other than in name. So the more empowered people are to take care of their environment, the better. And I think that that's how we begin to implement and address climate change. In fact, I think to some degree, as island communities, mitigation is important, but it's somewhat of a red herring. I mean, yes, we should be ambitious and change the world, because most of what the rest of the world is doing is going to affect us. It's going to be hard for us to change issues around carbon where we're just small island communities. And we know also with the rate of climate change that is happening, that the sea levels are going to rise whether we like it or not. And so we need to develop governance tools and habits and cultural practices and institutions that better address our needs to adapt to what's going to change. And I think that doing that has to do with our social, cultural infrastructure. And the current sort of somewhat senescent institutions we currently have managing our environment. We need to boost those institutions and help them find ways to work with the citizens to take care of the environment, not just dictate how we do that.
Interesting choice of words there. Maybe I can ask you about that later. So I do want to, one of the questions coming in from the audience is talking about, some of what you were talking about with sea level rise impacts and community driven support. At what point in time do we start to talk about retreating from the shoreline? Shouldn't every district on Oahu have agricultural support and self-sustainable opportunities? And that seems like something that maybe KUA has been involved in or would advocate for.
Well, I can't say that I'm a climate expert in any sense. I know that discussion definitely is happening in communities. I know that there are people on this call and in our community pushing for a stronger discussion around that issue. We know it's going to rise. Are we just going to sit around? It doesn't seem like the right thing to do. So, but I cannot answer that as an expert. And I'm getting too many reports and executive summaries telling me how the world's going to end. But I want people to talk about what we're going to do about it. It's nice to reflect on. It's like what is it? Mike Tyson says, you always have a plan until you get punched in the face. So sometimes it's like we're watching that fist come slowly at your face and you're asking yourself what you're going to do. But to some degree, you don't have the time. You got to act. You got to find a way to move forward. And I think that's where our communities are at.
All right. So if we are seeing that fist of climate change coming for us, and here now, and in some cases, where do you see areas of opportunity really for implementation to fill gaps in critical state and local climate policy or data or creating local will for action?
Kind of how I mentioned that, one, it's in our constitution that the traditions of the Native Hawaiian community here in Hawaii are part of how we should be living our life. And when I say environmental governance is a traditional practice, that we need to find out what is that spirit of environmental governance. What are the situated knowledge and practices that continue to exist in places where people still have a desire to play a role in taking care of their environment? And we should work with them, help them to be better citizens, and empower them to do that. That's how you start, because you do that, you start building a culture around environmental government, something that happens not just in government. Government is merely a tool for us to govern ourselves. Governance is a spirit that we can build regardless of participation in government. But we're also missing that. I mean, you see that not just in Hawaii, but across the nation, that we want governance. We're not sure how to build that anymore. And our governments no longer have the tools to help us do that either.
So how is KUA, you're making it real easy for me, what are methods that KUA is using to work on some of those those issues that you're mentioning?
You can look at our name. Our name is Kuaʻāina Ulu ʻAuamo, which means grassroots growing through shared responsibility. We were created by communities who want to share that responsibility with each other and our government. And they began to convene and began to talk about the common issues that they think are private soon become public. And when they realize they're public issues, they grow into a larger movement. And those communities created us to help them build that momentum.
Does this work tie into the Aina Aloha Economic Futures Initiative? That's a question coming in from the audience right now.
Certainly, we've participated in some ways in that effort, including submitting policy ideas. I think our closest relationship to what the folks are doing there have to do with things like fish ponds and the idea of restorative hatcheries, which are different than commercial hatcheries, and increasing, like I said, more community-based natural resource management initiatives, first starting with our fisheries.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thank you, everybody, for your questions. I think we are at the end of our time here. So thank you so much for your work, Kevin, and for representing the Hawaii delegation at the IUCN conference, and for joining us today. Aloha.
Mahalo.
And with that, I am going to invite our Climate Commission back on to close us out for this event. Anu?
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you all for engaging with us today. And a big mahalo to Governor Ige, Victoria to you, Kim, Kevin, and to my colleague, Robert Perkinson, and our production teams at UH and the Climate Commission. Wonderful conversation. If you're interested in keeping tabs on this issue and what we are doing with it, be sure to find us on our social media. Along with all of you working on this issue, we will continue to sound that drumbeat to COP26 and beyond. Aloha.